Steve Rose, investigador británico, se unió a Transform como el coordinador de campañas en 1998. Ahora es director de investigación para TDPF. Estudió Geografía Humana en la Universidad de Bristol y obtuvo una maestría en Desarrollo de Estudios en la Universidad de Manchester. Antes de unirse a Transform, trabajó durante un año en la India para el Consejo de Investigación Médica, manejando en gran escala el estudio de la salud en zonas rurales. Asimismo, trabajó con Oxfam, buscando parar el tráfico de armas y lograr el libre comercio.
Hello, I also want to add to the thanks to México D.F for the amazing job they've done with this really remarkable event, which I think it really will. I think it will be a moment in history. Transform Drug Policy Foundation, whom I work for, we're an NGO, we're a civil society organisation based in the UK, but we operate internationally, and we do policy analysis and campaigning around drug policy and law reform, and our website's down there at the bottom, so please do check it out. Okay, a bit of background. Since everybody else, an awful lot of the speakers have already been through all this about the failure on the war on drugs, I'm not going to dwell on it. But I just wanted to point out that the war on drugs has in fact failed. It's failed, and I think it's failed in two key ways. And again, I'm repeating what other people have said, but it's failed on its own terms because it set out to eliminate drugs from society, and clearly it hasn't done that. Every year that passes, we're further and further away from that goal. But perhaps more importantly, or equally importantly, it's created a raft of secondary harms associated with the huge criminal market that has emerged to service the growing demand for drugs that have been prohibited. And these harms, as I think Alex pointed out this morning, have been described by the executive director of the UNODC, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, as the unintended consequences of the global drug control system. They may be unintended, but they can no longer be called unanticipated. We know that this is what happens when you try and ban substances that are in high levels of demand. You inevitably create an illegal trade and all the problems that come along with that. And these unintended consequences, they actually impact on a huge range of policy arenas. It's not just crime, it's human rights issues, it's public health issues, it's environmental issues, it's economic issues. It really impacts on almost all spheres of life. Clearly, where it impacts the most differs from one place to another, but we all feel the impacts of the war on drugs, the negative impacts of the war on drugs. I think there's a very important distinction to make between the harms associated with drug use or with drug problematic use or drug misuse and the harms associated with the legal policy environment. And often in the public discourse on drugs, the two are kind of confused or conflated together. So harms that are actually a result of the policy environment, such as the violence in Mexico or the criminality associated with the illegal trade, are kind of blamed on drugs. And they're wrapped up in this kind of narrative about the evil and wickedness of drugs. And so the failings of the war on drugs somehow end up feeding a sort of strange circular logic. They end up feeding the continuation and sometimes enhancement of the war on drugs. And this is something we need to challenge, a logic that we need to challenge to move forward. I just want to flag up an initiative that Transform has taken the lead on, but we're working in partnership with many of the other organizations who are here today, the Count the Costs initiative. It's really trying to account for those unintended consequences. So our political leaders, even up to the United Nations, acknowledge these unintended consequences exist, but they make no real effort to systematically monitor, evaluate, and account for them. What this initiative is doing is really calling upon domestic governments and the United Nations to meaningfully count the costs of the war on drugs. There is a lot of good research out there, but it's not collated in any effective way, and it's not really feeding in a meaningful way into the discourse on the future of drug policy, and we're calling on governments to do that. And just to say, The website is translated into Spanish, and the thematic briefings under each of the headings of crime, human rights, public health, economics, the environment, and stigma and discrimination, they are also either already translated into Spanish or are soon to be translated into Spanish. And we've done this specifically with you in mind. So please do go and check this website out and these resources and get involved. And if you are a civil society group and you feel you can support this initiative, please contact us. So where next? Well, as we've heard from various speakers, there are many reforms already underway. We've heard from some of the speakers, some of our European representatives. There are a lot of things already happening. There have been particular advances in harm reduction. In many ways, Europe has led the way over the last 3 decades on harm reduction, and a lot of those innovations have now spread around the world. They've had a huge impact. They're extremely positive. These are things that clearly need to be supported and encouraged. Another important trend has been the trend towards decriminalization of personal possession and use. This is also happening now in I think, nearly 30 countries around the world, either of just cannabis or, in many countries, all drugs. It's happened, I believe, to a certain extent in Mexico, but my colleagues tell me that it's slightly inadequate the way they've implemented it. It hasn't happened in the UK yet, except perhaps arguably sort of happened with cannabis, but not really. But again, this is an important development that paves the way towards other future developments. And interestingly, I've noted here that Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia is one of the countries that's decriminalized all drugs. So I think we should shame the US by pointing to the leaders in drug law reform in Kyrgyzstan. And I say that, but even in the US, the spiritual home of the war on drugs, there are 14 states, I think, 13 or 14 states that have decriminalized cannabis possession, so that you only get, it's like a minor offense, you get like a parking ticket or a driving ticket equivalent fine. Now, these developments, they are all extremely important. They're to be encouraged. Transform has been involved in many of them. We're very supportive. But to a significant extent, they can be seen as symptomatic responses to harms that have been created by prohibition and the wider policy legal environment in the first instance. And we need to bear that in mind, that in some ways they're sort of band-aid solutions to a bigger structural problem. And it's addressing that structural problem, which is really where the debate around legalization and regulation comes in. So again, this has all been mentioned by so many people, I'm not going to dwell on it, but clearly there are, a lot of the Latin American countries are taking a lead on the debate on alternatives to prohibition. So Calderon has talked about market alternatives. We're not quite clear what he's talking about. I'm not quite sure he's clear what he's talking about. His wife didn't seem to be very clear what he was talking about. But anyway, it's on the table. Santos is obviously saying a lot. Molina recently. In some ways, the European countries, certainly organizations like myself, we're looking to Latin America for leadership on this issue, and it seems to be happening. So we're very pleased to say that. Not least, of course, by the Global Commission report and its predecessor, the Latin American Commission, which were hugely significant landmarks in the debate. Again, I think it's worth pointing out, these are things that would be impossible to have been said even 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. Something has changed. The debate has made a significant step change in the level of debate, certainly in terms of the level of engagement of heads of state. This is something I don't think anyone's mentioned yet, unless I missed it, was that there was an event called the Tuxtla Dialogue that took place last December. And at this dialogue, there were 8 Central and Latin American presidents, 1 vice president, and 2 ministerial level representatives. So 11 representatives of 11 countries. And you can read the text here. They talk about regulatory, the need for an exploration of regulatory or market-orientated options. That's pretty unambiguous what they're talking about. I think I'm amazed that this hasn't had more media coverage, but I would direct you all to it. It's a very significant, perhaps, watershed moment. 11 Latin American leaders put their names to this statement, including 8 presidents. So, if we are going to have a debate about legalization and regulation, clearly there needs to be some coherent, rational models for us to discuss. Historically, I think it's fair to say that the eloquent critiques of the war on drugs have not been matched by coherent alternatives to the war on drugs. So Transform, my organization, around 2007, we made a decision that we would try and pull together some of the leading thinkers in this area and try and come up with some sensible, rational, credible, coherent models of regulation that could at least form the basis for a serious discussion about what a post-drug war world would look like, how it might function for different drugs in different environments, and really just kind of flesh out what often was just like, yeah, the war on drugs hasn't worked, so let's legalize drugs. It's just not good enough. We need something more to work with, and that's what we've attempted to provide. It has been translated in full in Spanish. It's 250 pages long. It's available free. I'm not trying to sell the book. It's free online as a PDF, both of them. So please do go and look at it and let us know what you think. For our Brazilian colleagues, if there are any here, a Portuguese translation is on the way, but there is a Portuguese executive summary also available on the website. And if anyone here is Russian, Chinese, French, or Italian, there are also translations in those languages. It clearly seems to be having some impact. It's now been downloaded 350,000 times. So someone's reading it, and people are interested. What is regulation? Seems like a stupid question, but we really do need to answer it. Regulation of risky products and behaviors is one of the primary functions of government. It's what government does. And really, regulation of risky products and behaviors is very much the norm in almost all other spheres of life. And to that extent, I think we can see prohibition as the radical experiment, the anomaly within the wider policy sphere. Regulation of risky products and behaviors is just normal. It's not a weird thing to suggest. A couple of other small points. If you establish a regulatory framework, clearly anything that happens outside of that regulatory framework remains prohibited. So it's not legalization is maybe not a particularly useful word, because legalization is a process. I'm talking now about it's a process where something illegal becomes legal, but it really doesn't give you any indication of what the policy endpoint is, and that's what we need to be clear about and specify, and that's where the discussions need to move. Just another point that I've just noted at the bottom, we make a clear distinction between regulation and free markets, so libertarian free market models. We're very much not talking about that, and we're actually keen to distance ourselves from that point of view, from that position, and think it's not useful for the debate. And if any of you were here for Donald McPherson's presentation yesterday, the U-curve, we're looking for regulation which we see as sitting in the middle of a spectrum between free markets and sort of the war on drugs. So somewhere in between that spectrum, there are the regulatory models where we think the solutions will be found that will deliver the best outcomes. What do we regulate? Again, in many ways, this is obvious. We do this for almost every other product. But what do we regulate? Well, we can regulate production and transit, obviously. I'll come back to that. We can regulate the products themselves, and this is very important. We can regulate the dosage of any particular drug product. We can regulate the preparation. We can regulate the price. We can regulate the packaging. We can specify what information is on the packaging. We can have tamper-proofing. We can have child-proofing. There are a whole range of things we can do with the product itself. We can regulate the vendor. The vendors can be licensed, they can be vetted, there can be training requirements. These are all things that we do with many different products already. We can regulate the outlets. We can regulate their location. We can regulate the density of location. We can regulate their appearance. We can regulate their hours of opening. One thing I haven't put on here, but I should have done, so I apologize. We can regulate marketing and commercialization. So I'd slightly take issue with Mark Kleiman's characterization of the legalization debate, which I think was rather US-centric. We don't have to have aggressive commercial models. It's a blank slate. We can shape this market, these regulations, however we like, and that includes potentially having state monopolies and bans on any kind of marketing or commercial activity at all. Those may be imperfect bans, bans generally are, but this is an option, and there are models certainly with alcohol in Canada in some places, in Sweden, in Russia in the past. There are models of state monopolies for drug production and supply. So what we have here is a flexible menu of options. Clearly there's no one-size-fits-all. Different drugs will need different combinations of regulatory tools applied to them. The more risky a drug is, the more rigorous the regulation will need to be, the more restrictive models, the less dangerous a drug is, relatively less so. It's not a one-size-fits-all, and we need to adapt models according to evidence. We would see what works. This is a flexible model, and it's flexible between drugs, but it's also flexible through time, depending on what evidence emerges of what's working and what isn't. I'm just going to skip through this really very quickly. I just wanted to point out that in terms of the production side, legal production of drugs, it's really not that big an issue, I don't think. Here's some pictures of some legal drugs that exists now. This is heroin that Peter will be familiar with from some of the medical experiments. Here's some medical cocaine. This is, the coca leaf is grown in Peru. It's taken to the US by the Drug Enforcement Agency. It's processed by pharmaceutical companies. The cocaine goes for medical use. The decocainized coca leaf goes to the Coca-Cola company to flavor the world's favorite drink. We know how to do these things. This is some medical cannabis. Medical cannabis is grown by the federal government in the US still, amazingly, and quite extensively by the federal government in Canada, I believe. So again, we know how to do that. And this is some pharmaceutical amphetamines. So we already produce all of these drugs legally for medical uses. We know how to do it. Expanding the production to move into non-medical supply doesn't seem like that big a challenge. There may be important issues around development issues. So, if we moved into a legal cocaine market or coca market, it may have serious impacts, economic impacts on some of the producer countries. Clearly, we need to bear that in mind. But in terms of the know-how, in terms of producing these products in ways that avoids any security issues or leakage issues, we really know how to do that already, and I don't think it's that big a challenge. Five basic, the drug supply side of things, I'm running out of time, the drug supply side of things is rather more of a challenge because we have less experience with it. But Transform have proposed in the blueprint, but we've proposed 5 basic models that can be applied to different drugs. A medical prescription model, I don't think I need to go into too much detail as we've just had some very interesting presentations on that. I think one point that was worth pointing out is that it's not just heroin. In the UK, we have about 400 people who are prescribed heroin. We have 2,000 people who are prescribed amphetamines. And we have 2 guys prescribed cocaine. They're legends on the drug scene, these 2 guys. It's not a very well-established modality, as Peter pointed out. Clearly, it's the most restrictive, it's the most expensive, it's only applicable to a small population of users. But the point is, we don't need legalization for that. That model already exists. And as such, it's a really useful indicator of how transitioning from a criminal supply to a legal supply gets rid of an enormous amount of the social and health harms associated with a particular drug. Moving down, we've suggested a specialist pharmacist model. This is effectively a retail model, but where you have a gatekeeper who is a trained medical professional in the model of a pharmacist. So they're trained to give advice, they're trained to give health advice, maybe direct people to services, and they're also licensed and required to prevent access according to certain criteria. I won't go into too much detail about that now. There's various forms of licensed retailing, really, which would be modeled using some of those tools I've already described as appropriate to a particular drug in a particular environment. Moving on down, there's a model for licensed premises, consumption, where you buy your drugs and you consume them on a premises. The most obvious model for this is obviously a bar where you consume and drink alcohol, but the cannabis coffee shops in the Netherlands are another useful example. probably appropriate for the lower risk drugs. The pharmacy model probably appropriate for the middle risk drugs. Clearly the medical model is for the most risky drugs, particularly injectable drugs. And at the bottom we've got unlicensed sales, which would be for things like coca tea, caffeine drinks, really the drugs associated with negligible harms. And here's just some pictures of what I was saying. That's the Insight. They don't actually provide heroin at Insight, but it's the Swiss clinics and the UK clinics, they're very much, I couldn't find a picture of them, but that's kind of what they look like. Look, there's a pharmacy. This is a cannabis coffee shop in the Netherlands, and this is a supermarket where you can buy your Red Bull energy drinks or Coca tea, maybe. Well, you can buy Red Bull, you can't buy Coca tea yet. So moving forward, and I've got 12 seconds left. A few final thoughts. It's very important, picking up on another thing that Mark Kleiman pointed out, it's very important to learn from the successes and failings of alcohol and tobacco policy, particularly around the intrinsic issues with over-commercialization and over-marketing, which clearly lead to unacceptable public health costs. I think we're in a position to learn from that. I think the UN Framework Convention on Tobacco Control is a very useful model, certainly for cannabis. It really incorporates many of the lessons from mistakes that have been made with tobacco control in the past. And certainly in Europe, I don't really know what the experience is in Mexico, we've made huge strides with tobacco control, doing precisely the kind of regulations that I've been talking about. We've seen tobacco use fall by 40 or 50% in the last 30 years without resorting to punitive blanket prohibitions. There have been prohibitions on individuals, but these are sort of individual parts of the market, but these are what I would view as regulatory frameworks. It's not a blanket punitive prohibition. A quick point, we haven't got a moderator to stop me, so I'm just going to carry on. A couple of minutes? 1 minute, okay. I was just going to say regulation can be used to create a kind of gradient. If you have, as I suggested, the more risky drugs more restrictively controlled, the less risky drugs less restrictively controlled, you can, I think, over time, encourage a movement from more risky products, behaviors, and using environments to less risky products, behaviors, and using environments. And I think it's important to point out that under prohibition, the gradient tilts the other way. It tends to push behaviors towards more risky, high-risk behaviors, high-risk products, and pushes people into marginal, high-risk environments. It's important to view change as it's likely to be an incremental process. It's not necessarily going to be radical. We can have a debate about this, whether we should just go nuclear and just do it. My view as a British pragmatist is that we need to be a bit more cautious, see what works, experiment maybe with cannabis first, and develop it from there. But yes, we need to follow the evidence. And really just finally to state the obvious. Policy must always be rooted in science, in human rights, and public health principles. I was going to finish with a picture of my children, but I thought that was a bit cheesy. But I kind of wish I had now, because I hope they don't do drugs, but I certainly don't want them growing up in a war zone. Thank you very much.
Ya les pasé las preguntas para que las fueran ustedes analizando y nos den sus comentarios. Una pregunta que creo que a lo mejor está en boca de varios, y aquí me va a traicionar mi vocación como abogado, es que a la hora de estudiar los casos, particularmente Portugal y Holanda, nos llama mucho la atención este problema de la puerta trasera. Hay una especie de dicotomía en la desregulación que se está haciendo, o la regulación propiamente de la venta de drogas, en la cual en cierto lugar se pueden consumir y sin embargo la forma en que las drogas llegan a ese lugar es de índole ilegal. Entonces creo que para los que hemos estudiado eso y particularmente para los que no lo han podido revisar, sería interesante sus palabras que expliquen cómo funciona algo que en un lugar es legal y sin embargo el suministro es ilegal. A lo mejor nos pueden explicar eso y pasar a contestar las preguntas que ustedes tienen. Tenemos más o menos 20 minutos, entonces pueden contestar eso y después quizá usar 5 minutos cada uno para contestar preguntas o dar sus comentarios finales. Gracias.
I mean, I think the reason that system, which is clearly paradoxical and unsustainable, it remains in place is because of the commitment to the UN Convention. So they kind of have pushed the spirit and letter of the UN Convention's restrictions really to breaking point. And if they were to move to legally produced supply, it would just cross the line in the sand. And I think that's were the conventions not there, or were the conventions more flexible, I think the Netherlands would have gone down that road some time ago. Is that fair? I've got 2 minutes and 3 really difficult questions. The first one I think might be from Mark. It's how would we regulate crack, cocaine, presumably in the US? Just as a slight cop-out, there's a chapter on stimulants in Blueprint which deals fairly extensively with the crack question, which always comes up in legalization debates. I think really you have to look at the bigger stimulants picture. In the short term, I think you have to have a harm reduction response. We have some experience with that now, I believe, in Insight. There's a crack smoking... Am I allowed to talk about that? There's a crack smoking room. There is a model for supervised crack use and some crack harm reduction in terms of rubber ends for pipes and so on. I think crack use is kind of at the hardcore end of problematic drug use, and often really you are looking at more of a medical response than it's hard to imagine any retail model. And we haven't suggested that any retail model would be appropriate for crack. Clearly, if there was powder cocaine available in any form, you could make powder cocaine into crack relatively easily. So if there's cocaine available, there's crack available, and we just have to live with that and have a treatment, harm reduction, and education response. Hopefully, if you can get people into some kind of harm reduction programs, you then have access to them, and you're more likely to be able to help them stop using crack or move to safer drugs or preparations. I think probably in the longer term, the answer is to do with the regulatory gradient concept that I briefly mentioned at the end. If we make lower dose, slower release, safer preparations of stimulants, including potentially cocaine, available, I think they would absorb a lot of the demand for stimulants more broadly. And in the longer term, hopefully we could prevent the progression of people, the pressure of the illegal market economic dynamic of people to push them into crack use in the first place. So in the short term, I think it's an emergency harm reduction response. In the longer term, I think it's looking at the bigger picture of stimulants, trying to make safer stimulants available that would cater for as much of the market as possible and prevent progression into crack use in the longer term. I'm out of time. I've got one question that was on the regulating drugs on the internet, which I don't... If anyone wants to talk to me about that afterwards, I don't know who said that one. You can't actually send drugs down the internet. It's only marketing of drugs. Maybe they'll find a way of sending drugs down the internet, which that would be a challenge. But really, I mean, I think you build that into your regulatory framework. If people are doing illegal activity, you prosecute them. I'm not overly concerned. There was a problem in the UK with legal highs, some of these emerging stimulants being sold on the internet. They've subsequently been banned, and those sales have effectively stopped. And the sales on the internet have stopped. The stuff is still for sale, just not on the internet anymore because it's too obvious. And then there was another question about I think this is a question about how you regulate, how you might do some of the things I was talking about in countries where there is very poor governance and large amounts of corruption. This is a really difficult question. I hope I said at the beginning, I come at this from a European perspective. I guess that's why I'm on this panel. The models I was talking about really are only going to work for developed countries and maybe some of the middle-income countries. For the less developed or very highly underdeveloped countries, we have a real challenge, and I think that is a debate that's yet to be had. And unfortunately, I've run out of time, and I don't have a chance to have it now. There is some discussion on all of these issues in Blueprint. So I'll do my cop-out answer again and say, go and read the book. Thanks very much.